Have you ever witnessed courage so breathtaking it made someone fall hopelessly in love with you? When a brave young woman risked everything to save a child from danger, she never dreamed the grateful father would appear at her doorstep with flowers, his heart completely surrendered to her extraordinary spirit. The rain had been falling relentlessly for hours, pounding against the windows of Eliza Bennett's small apartment. The weather forecast had predicted a severe storm, but no one expected the fury with which it had descended upon the quiet coastal town of Millhaven. Eliza stood by her window, watching as the streets below transformed into rushing rivers, the water level rising at an alarming rate. The 32-year-old marine biologist had seen tropical storms before, but there was something particularly ominous about this one. Her phone buzzed with another emergency alert. Flash flood warning. Seek higher ground immediately. Eliza's brow furrowed as she looked down at the message. Most of her neighbors had evacuated earlier that day when the first warnings came through, but she had stayed behind to secure important research documents from her home office. Now she wondered if she had waited too long. The sound of her wind chimes violently clanging against each other pulled her attention back to the window. The water in the street had risen at least another foot in the past 20 minutes. It was time to go. Eliza quickly grabbed her emergency backpack, the waterproof case containing her research, and her rain gear. As she opened her door, the hallway of her apartment building was eerily quiet. Everyone else had already left. The stairwell echoed with the sound of her footsteps as she made her way down to the ground floor. When she pushed open the heavy door leading outside, the force of the wind nearly knocked her back. Rain pelted her face like tiny needles as she stepped into the storm, immediately soaking through her supposedly waterproof jacket. The water in the street was already up to her mid-calf, the current strong enough to make maintaining balance difficult. Eliza's car was parked just down the block, and she hoped it would still start. She hadn't moved it to higher ground, another decision she was now regretting. As she struggled against the current, a sound cut through the howling wind, a cry, high-pitched and desperate. Eliza stopped, listening intently, unsure if she had imagined it. There it was again, unmistakably a child's voice calling for help. She turned toward the source of the sound, squinting through the sheets of rain. Across the street, barely visible through the downpour, was a small figure clinging to a lamppost, surrounded by rapidly rising water that had already reached the child's waist. Without hesitation, Eliza changed direction, fighting against the current to reach the stranded child. "Hold on!" she shouted, her voice nearly lost in the roar of the storm. "I'm coming to help you!" As Eliza got closer, she could see it was a little girl, no more than 6 or 7 years old, her face a mask of terror as she clung desperately to the metal pole. The water was rising quickly, already reaching the child's chest. "My name is Eliza," she called out, trying to sound calmer than she felt. "What's your name?" "Sophie," the girl stammered through chattering teeth, her small body trembling. "I can't find my dad." Eliza was only a few feet away now, the current growing stronger with each passing minute. "I'm going to get you out of here, Sophie. Just keep holding on." A sudden surge of water nearly knocked Eliza off her feet. She grabbed onto a nearby railing to steady herself, her heart pounding in her chest. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. In the distance, she could hear the wail of emergency sirens, but they sounded too far away. Help wouldn't arrive in time. "Sophie, I need you to be very brave," Eliza said, inching closer to the terrified child. "When I reach you, I want you to let go of the pole and hold onto my neck, okay? I'm going to carry you to safety." The little girl nodded, her eyes wide with fear but showing a flicker of trust. Eliza made her final approach, wrapping one arm securely around the lamppost while extending the other towards Sophie. Just as their fingertips touched, a massive surge of water hit them both. Sophie's grip on the pole faltered, and she was instantly swept away by the current. Without thinking, Eliza let go of her own support and lunged after the child, diving into the churning floodwaters. The current immediately pulled them both downstream, but Eliza's powerful swimmer's arms cut through the water, allowing her to reach the flailing child within seconds. She wrapped her arm around Sophie's small body, pulling her close. "I've got you," she gasped, fighting to keep both their heads above water. "Hold on to me and don't let go." Sophie's arms locked around Eliza's neck in a death grip as they were carried down the flooded street. Eliza scanned their surroundings, looking for anything they could grab onto. Up ahead, a partially submerged car had created a temporary barrier where debris was collecting. If they could reach it, they might be able to climb on top and wait for rescue. Using every ounce of strength, Eliza swam diagonally across the current, aiming for the car. Her muscles screamed in protest, the weight of the child and the force of the water making each movement a struggle. Sophie was sobbing against her neck, the little girl's entire body shaking with cold and fear. "We're almost there," Eliza encouraged, though she wasn't entirely convinced herself. The car was still several yards away, and the current seemed determined to pull them in the opposite direction. A floating tree branch suddenly slammed into Eliza's back, the impact momentarily pushing them both underwater. She fought her way back to the surface, gasping for air, making sure Sophie's head was also clear of the water. The collision had pushed them closer to the car, but it had also caused a sharp pain to radiate from Eliza's shoulder down her arm. Ignoring the pain, she made one final push toward the vehicle. Her fingertips brushed against the smooth metal of the car's roof. Once, twice, before she finally managed to get a grip. With strength born of pure desperation, Eliza hoisted Sophie onto the roof of the car before pulling herself up beside her. They lay there for a moment, both gasping for breath, the rain still pounding down on them relentlessly. Sophie was crying softly, her small body curled against Eliza's side, seeking warmth and comfort. "Are we safe now?" Sophie asked, her voice barely audible above the storm. Eliza looked around, assessing their situation. The car was stable for now, but the water was still rising. They couldn't stay here indefinitely. "We're safer than we were before," she answered honestly, "and help is coming. We just need to hold on a little longer." As if on cue, the sound of a boat engine cut through the roar of the storm. Eliza looked up to see a rescue boat making its way carefully down the flooded street, a searchlight sweeping back and forth across the water. "Here!" she shouted, waving her arms frantically. "We're over here!" The light swung in their direction, illuminating them in its bright beam. The boat changed course, heading straight for them. Relief flooded through Eliza's body, making her suddenly aware of how cold and exhausted she was. Sophie pressed closer against her, small fingers clutching Eliza's soaked jacket. "See? I told you help was coming," Eliza said, smoothing back the child's wet hair. "You were so brave, Sophie, so very brave." The rescue boat pulled alongside the car, two emergency responders in bright yellow gear reaching out to help them aboard. One of them took Sophie first, wrapping her immediately in a thermal blanket. As they helped Eliza into the boat, she winced at the pain in her shoulder. "Are you injured?" one of the rescuers asked, noticing her discomfort. "I think I might have hurt my shoulder," she admitted, "but it's not serious. Please, take care of Sophie first." The little girl refused to be separated from her rescuer, insisting on sitting right beside Eliza as the boat made its way back through the flooded streets toward higher ground. A medic aboard the boat checked Sophie's vital signs while Eliza provided what little information she knew. "She said she was looking for her father," Eliza explained. "I don't know how she ended up alone in the flood." "What's your dad's name, sweetheart?" the medic asked gently. "Daniel Walsh," Sophie replied, her teeth still chattering despite the blanket wrapped around her. "He told me to stay in the car while he helped our neighbors, but then the water came so fast and I got scared, so I tried to find him." The medic nodded, speaking quietly into his radio, providing the father's name to emergency coordinators. Eliza held Sophie's small hand, trying to provide comfort as the boat navigated through what had once been familiar streets, now transformed into a treacherous waterway. When they finally reached the emergency evacuation center set up in the high school gymnasium on the hill overlooking the town, Eliza was relieved to be on solid ground again. The gymnasium was filled with other evacuees, families huddled together on cots, volunteers distributing hot drinks and food. Medical personnel moved quickly among those needing attention. Sophie still clung to Eliza's hand as they were led to a medical station for evaluation. The doctor examined Sophie first, confirming that beyond being cold and frightened, the child was unharmed. When it was Eliza's turn, the diagnosis was a mild shoulder sprain, nothing that wouldn't heal with time and rest. "You're very lucky," the doctor told her. "Both of you." Eliza nodded, though luck had little to do with it. It had been split-second decisions and sheer determination that had kept them both alive. As the doctor finished wrapping her shoulder, a commotion at the entrance of the gymnasium caught her attention. A man burst through the doors, soaking wet and wild-eyed, frantically scanning the crowd. "Sophie!" he called out, his voice hoarse with desperation. "Sophie Walsh!" The little girl's head snapped up, her face lighting up with recognition. "Daddy!" she cried, jumping off the examination table and running toward him. The man fell to his knees, gathering his daughter in his arms, holding her as if he never intended to let go again. Eliza watched from a distance, a small smile on her face despite her exhaustion. This was why she had risked everything, for this moment of reunion, for the relief and joy on both their faces. After a long embrace, Sophie pulled back slightly, turning to point in Eliza's direction. "That's the lady who saved me, Daddy. She jumped in the water and got me when I was being swept away." The man looked up, his eyes meeting Eliza's across the crowded gymnasium. Even from a distance, she could see the intensity of emotion in his gaze, gratitude, relief, and something else she couldn't quite identify. He stood, still holding his daughter's hand, and began making his way toward her. Eliza suddenly felt self-conscious about her appearance, soaking wet, hair plastered to her head, clothes muddy and torn from their ordeal. But the man approaching her didn't seem to notice any of that. His focus was entirely on her face, his eyes never leaving hers as he crossed the room. When he finally stood before her, Eliza was struck by the raw emotion in his expression. He was tall, with dark hair now plastered to his forehead from the rain, and eyes the same warm brown as his daughter's. There was a small cut on his cheek, and his clothes were as soaked and muddy as hers, evidence that he too had been fighting against the flood. "You saved my daughter's life," he said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, filled with a depth of gratitude that needed no further elaboration. Eliza smiled softly, suddenly feeling shy under the intensity of his gaze. "Anyone would have done the same," she replied. "Anyone would have done the same," Eliza replied. The man shook his head firmly. "No, not everyone would have risked their life diving into floodwaters to save a stranger's child." His voice was deep and resonant, steady despite the emotion behind it. "My name is Daniel Walsh, and He paused, seeming to search for words adequate to express his feelings. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you for what you've done." Sophie tugged at her father's hand. "She was really brave, Daddy. The water was so scary, but she didn't even seem afraid." Eliza smiled at the little girl. "Oh, I was definitely afraid. Sometimes being brave means doing something even when you're scared." Daniel knelt down to Sophie's level. "Why don't you go with the nice volunteer over there and get some hot chocolate while I talk to Miss Bennett?" Eliza supplied. "Eliza Bennett." "While I talk to Miss Bennett," Daniel finished. Sophie looked hesitant to leave her father's side after their separation. "I'll be right here," Daniel assured her. "I can see you the whole time, and you can see me. I promise I'm not going anywhere." After a moment's consideration, Sophie nodded and allowed the volunteer to lead her to the refreshment table, though she kept glancing back at her father every few steps. Once Sophie was settled with her hot chocolate, Daniel turned back to Eliza, running a hand through his wet hair. "I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if you hadn't been there," he said quietly. "I never should have left her in the car. I thought it was safe, parked on high ground. I was helping an elderly couple evacuate their home when the water rose so quickly. By the time I got back, the car was surrounded and Sophie was gone." His voice cracked slightly. "I've been searching for hours." "She's a brave little girl," Eliza said. "She was trying to find you when I spotted her." Daniel nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "She's all I have in this world." Something in his tone told Eliza there was a painful story behind those words, but she didn't pry. Instead, she asked, "Are you both from Millhaven? I don't think I've seen you around before." "We moved here about 6 months ago," Daniel explained. "I'm a structural engineer. I came to work on the new bridge project, and it seemed like a good place to make a fresh start for Sophie and me after—" He trailed off, then simply said, "After we lost her mother." "I'm sorry," Eliza said softly. Daniel nodded in acknowledgement. "What about you? Have you lived here long?" "All my life, except for college and graduate school," Eliza replied. "I'm a marine biologist. I work at the Coastal Research Center just north of town." Before Daniel could respond, a harried-looking emergency coordinator approached them. "Mr. Walsh, we've located your vehicle, but I'm afraid it's been completely submerged. Is there somewhere you and your daughter can stay tonight? The evacuation center will remain open, but it's not ideal for families with children." Daniel's expression fell. "I haven't really thought that far ahead. Our apartment is in the flooded zone. I suppose we could find a hotel if any have vacancies." "Most hotels are already full with evacuees," the coordinator said apologetically. "We're trying to place families with young children first, but resources are stretched thin." Eliza found herself speaking before she'd fully thought it through. "I have a spare room at my mother's house. It's on the hillside, well away from the flooding. You and Sophie would be welcome to stay there until you can return to your apartment." Daniel looked at her, surprise evident in his expression. "That's incredibly generous, but we couldn't impose like that. You've already done so much." "It's no imposition," Eliza insisted. "My mother's house has plenty of space. She passed away last year, and I've been staying there occasionally while sorting through her things." A brief shadow crossed her face. "Actually, I'd welcome the company. The place feels too empty sometimes." Daniel studied her face, seemingly trying to decide if the offer was genuine. "Are you sure?" "Completely sure," Eliza replied with a smile. "Besides, I think Sophie could use some stability right now, and the evacuation center isn't exactly conducive to that." After a moment's hesitation, Daniel nodded. "Thank you. Truly." A medical volunteer approached with dry clothes for both of them, donated items that didn't fit perfectly but were warm and clean. Once they had changed and Eliza's shoulder had been properly examined, they collected Sophie and prepared to leave the evacuation center. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, though the sky remained overcast and threatening. Emergency vehicles continued to arrive and depart, their lights painting the wet pavement in flashes of red and blue. The devastation was clearly visible even from their elevated position. The lower part of town was still largely underwater, with only rooftops and the upper stories of buildings visible in some areas. Daniel stood for a long moment, staring at the flooded town below. "Everything we own is down there," he said quietly. Eliza placed a gentle hand on his arm. "The water will recede. Things can be replaced." He turned to look at her, his expression softening. "Yes, they can. What matters is that Sophie is safe, thanks to you." Sophie, who had been holding her father's hand tightly since they reunited, reached out and took Eliza's hand as well. The simple gesture of trust from the child brought a lump to Eliza's throat. A volunteer with an SUV drove them up to Eliza's mother's house, a charming two-story Victorian perched on the hillside overlooking the town and the ocean beyond. In different circumstances, the view would have been breathtaking. Today, it showed the full extent of the disaster that had befallen Millhaven. "It's a beautiful home," Daniel remarked as they made their way up the front steps. "It's been in our family for generations," Eliza explained, unlocking the door. "My great-grandfather built it. He was a sea captain." Inside, the house was filled with antique furniture and nautical mementos, model ships in bottles, weathered maps framed on walls, a ship's wheel mounted above the fireplace. Despite its age and grandeur, it had a warm, lived-in feeling. "Wow," Sophie said, her eyes wide as she took in her surroundings. "It's like a museum." Eliza smiled. "A lot of this stuff came from my great-grandfather's voyages. He traveled all over the world." She showed them to the guest room, which had 2 beds, a queen-sized one and a smaller twin bed that had been Eliza's when she was a child. "I think this will work for you both. The bathroom is just across the hall. I'll find some towels and see if I can rustle up some more clothes for you." "This is more than we could have asked for," Daniel said. "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks necessary," Eliza replied. "I'm just glad I could help." While Daniel got Sophie settled, Eliza went to the kitchen to prepare some hot soup. Her shoulder ached from the earlier injury, but she managed to heat up homemade chicken soup from her mother's well-stocked freezer. By the time Daniel and Sophie joined her, the kitchen was filled with the comforting aroma of warm food. "That smells amazing," Daniel said, entering the kitchen with Sophie. "My mother always kept emergency supplies, including frozen homemade soup for any crisis," Eliza explained with a smile. She believed food was the first step to solving any problem. As they ate, Sophie began to open up, her initial shyness giving way to the natural curiosity of childhood. "Were you scared when you jumped into the water to save me?" she asked Eliza between spoonfuls of soup. Eliza considered her answer carefully. "I was scared, yes. But sometimes when we see someone needs help, something inside us becomes stronger than the fear." "Like superheroes," Sophie nodded sagely. "Exactly like superheroes," Daniel agreed, giving Eliza a look of profound appreciation over his daughter's head. After dinner, exhaustion quickly caught up with Sophie. Her eyelids grew heavy and she began to yawn widely. Daniel excused himself to put her to bed, leaving Eliza alone in the kitchen. She stood at the window, looking out at the lights of emergency vehicles still visible in the town below, reflecting on the day's events. When Daniel returned, he found her still there, lost in thought. "She fell asleep almost immediately," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. Eliza turned, offering him a tired smile. "It's been quite a day for her, for all of us." "Would you mind if I joined you?" he asked, gesturing to the window. "I'm not sure I could sleep just yet." "Of course." Eliza moved slightly to make room for him. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the distant activities below. "Your shoulder, how is it feeling?" Daniel asked eventually. "It'll be fine," Eliza assured him. "Just a mild sprain. I've had worse from my fieldwork." "Fieldwork?" "That's right. You mentioned you're a marine biologist." Eliza nodded. "I study the impact of climate change on coastal ecosystems. Actually, storms like this one are becoming more frequent and more severe because of rising ocean temperatures." "That must be fascinating work," Daniel said, genuine interest in his voice. "Though I imagine days like today highlight the real-world consequences of what you study." "Yes," Eliza agreed softly. "It's one thing to analyze data and quite another to see the effects firsthand." She paused, then asked, "What about you? You mentioned you're working on the bridge project?" Daniel nodded. "I specialize in structures that can withstand extreme weather events. The irony isn't lost on me that I moved here to build a flood-resistant bridge only to get caught in a historic flood." They both smiled at that, finding a moment of levity in the midst of a difficult day. "Sophie seems like a remarkable child," Eliza commented after another comfortable silence. "She is," Daniel agreed, his expression softening with pride and love. "She's been through so much in her young life, but she remains so resilient. Kids are amazing that way, I think. They can teach us adults a lot about adaptability. How long? Eliza began, then hesitated, not wanting to pry into painful territory. How long has it been since her mother died? Daniel finished for her. 2 years next month. Cancer. It was quick, too quick. One day Rebecca was healthy, the next she was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. She was gone 3 months later. His voice was steady, but Eliza could hear the undercurrent of grief still present. "I'm so sorry," she said, instinctively placing her hand on his arm. Daniel looked down at her hand, then met her eyes. "Thank you for everything today, for saving Sophie, for opening your home to us, for just listening." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. Eliza felt it like a physical thing, this sudden bond with a man she had only met hours ago. "It's getting late," she said softly, reluctantly withdrawing her hand. "We should probably try to get some rest. Tomorrow will be a busy day for everyone." Daniel nodded. "You're right. Good night, Eliza, and thank you again." "Good night, Daniel." As she made her way to her own bedroom, Eliza found herself reflecting on the strange turns life could take. This morning, she had been alone in her apartment, focused on her research and the approaching storm. Now her home sheltered a man and his daughter who had been strangers just hours ago, yet somehow already felt important to her life. Outside, the clouds finally began to break, revealing a few stars twinkling in the night sky. The worst of the storm had passed, but something told Eliza that the most significant changes it would bring to her life were just beginning. Eliza woke to the sound of quiet laughter floating up from downstairs. For a moment, she was disoriented, the familiar surroundings of her childhood bedroom momentarily foreign in the early morning light. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, the flood, the rescue, the strangers who were now guests in her mother's home. She glanced at the clock on the bedside table. 7:23 a.m. Despite the physical and emotional exhaustion of yesterday, she had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with rushing water and desperate cries for help. Pushing back the covers, she winced as pain shot through her injured shoulder. The doctor had warned her it would be stiff and sore for a few days. After a quick shower, Eliza dressed in simple jeans and a sweater, more of the clothes she kept at her mother's house for her frequent visits. She paused at the top of the stairs, listening to the sounds from below. Sophie's high, clear voice was explaining something with great animation, punctuated by Daniel's deeper tones and occasional chuckles. The scene that greeted her in the kitchen made her pause in the doorway. Daniel stood at the stove, expertly flipping pancakes, while Sophie sat at the table, surrounded by crayons and paper, drawing with intense concentration. They had made themselves at home in a way that should have felt intrusive but somehow didn't. "Good morning," Eliza said, stepping into the kitchen. Sophie looked up, her face brightening. "Eliza, look! I'm drawing our adventure!" She held up a colorful rendering of 3 stick figures, one small, 2 large, standing on what appeared to be a rooftop surrounded by blue squiggles that presumably represented the floodwaters. "That's wonderful, Sophie," Eliza said, moving closer to admire the artwork. "You're quite the artist." Daniel turned from the stove, spatula in hand. "I hope you don't mind that we raided your kitchen. Sophie woke up hungry and I thought the least I could do was make breakfast for everyone." "Not at all," Eliza replied, touched by the gesture. "It smells amazing." "Daddy makes the best pancakes in the whole world," Sophie informed her solemnly. "Is that so?" Eliza said, taking a seat at the table. "Then I'm in for a treat." Daniel placed a plate of golden pancakes in front of her. "I found some blueberries in your freezer. I hope that was okay." "More than okay," Eliza assured him, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. "Thank you for this." As they ate, the conversation turned to practical matters. Daniel had called the emergency management office early that morning and learned that it would be at least a week before residents could return to the flooded areas of town to assess damage to their homes and retrieve belongings. They've set up a temporary office at the high school for insurance claims and emergency assistance, Daniel explained, pouring more orange juice for Sophie. I thought I'd head over there this morning to get the paperwork started. I'll drive you, Eliza offered immediately. My car is at my apartment, which is probably still underwater, but my mother's car is in the garage. You don't have to do that, Daniel began, but Eliza waved away his protest. I need to go into town anyway. The research center will be coordinating with emergency services to assess environmental impact. Besides, I want to check on my apartment too. Daniel studied her for a moment, then nodded. Thank you. Again. After breakfast, they prepared to head into town. The weather had cleared overnight, with the morning sun now shining brightly, creating a deceptive picture of normalcy that would be shattered as soon as they descended into the valley where Millhaven proper lay. Can I stay here? Sophie asked suddenly as they were about to leave. I don't want to see the scary water again. Daniel knelt down to her level. Sweetheart, the dangerous part is over. The water is going down now, and I don't want to leave you alone. I'll be brave, Sophie insisted, and I want to finish my drawing for Eliza. Daniel looked up at Eliza, uncertainty clear in his expression. My neighbor Mrs. Holloway could look in on her, Eliza suggested. She's a retired kindergarten teacher who's known me my whole life. I trust her completely. After a brief call to Mrs. Holloway, who was delighted to help, they arranged for her to come over and stay with Sophie. Once the elderly woman arrived, full of warmth and gentle questions that immediately put Sophie at ease, Daniel finally felt comfortable leaving his daughter. The drive into town revealed the full extent of the disaster. Streets that had been underwater the previous day were now exposed, covered in mud, debris, and the occasional fish stranded by the receding floodwaters. Emergency crews worked throughout the affected areas, pumping water from buildings, clearing roads, and assessing structural damage. It's worse than I imagined, Daniel murmured as they passed a row of shops with shattered windows and waterlogged merchandise scattered across the sidewalk. Millhaven has weathered storms before, Eliza said, though even she was shocked by the devastation. We'll rebuild. At the high school, they found organized chaos. Hundreds of displaced residents filled the gymnasium, now transformed into an emergency assistance center. Tables were set up with representatives from insurance companies, FEMA, the Red Cross, and various local agencies. The line for each station stretched across the room. This could take hours, Daniel sighed, looking at the crowds. Why don't you get started here? Eliza suggested. I need to check in at the research center, but I can come back for you later. Daniel hesitated. Are you sure? I don't want to take advantage of your kindness. You're not, Eliza assured him. We're all in this together now. She wrote her cell phone number on a slip of paper and handed it to him. Call me when you're done, or if you need anything. Their eyes met and held for a moment longer than necessary. Eliza felt a flutter of something in her chest, something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Pushing the feeling aside, she gave him a quick smile and left, navigating her way through the crowded gymnasium. The Coastal Research Center was located on higher ground north of town, its modern glass and steel structure a stark contrast to the Victorian homes and quaint shops that characterized most of Millhaven. As Eliza drove up the winding road to the facility, she was relieved to see it appeared undamaged by the storm. Inside, she found her colleagues already hard at work, analyzing data and coordinating with emergency services. Dr. Marcus Chen, the center's director and Eliza's mentor, looked up from his computer when she entered the main lab. Eliza, thank God you're all right. We've been trying to reach you since yesterday. My phone was ruined in the flood, she explained. I was caught in the middle of it while trying to evacuate. Dr. Chen's eyes widened as she recounted her rescue of Sophie. You could have been killed, he said when she finished. I couldn't just leave her there, Eliza replied simply. The older scientist shook his head, a mixture of exasperation and pride in his expression. Always diving in head first, literally this time. But I'm glad you and the child are safe. He paused, studying her face. And this father? What's he like? Eliza felt heat rise to her cheeks. He's grateful. A good father. They're staying at my mother's house until they can return to their apartment. I see, Dr. Chen said, a knowing look in his eyes that Eliza chose to ignore. She quickly changed the subject. What can I do to help here? For the next several hours, Eliza threw herself into work, helping to process water samples and document initial findings on the environmental impact of the flood. The familiar routine of scientific inquiry was comforting after the chaos of the previous day, allowing her to focus on concrete facts and methodical procedures rather than the confusing emotions stirred up by her new house guests. It was mid-afternoon when her borrowed office phone rang. Dr. Bennett speaking, she answered absently, still reviewing data on her computer screen. Eliza? It's Daniel. His voice sent an unexpected jolt through her. I've finished most of the paperwork here. They're saying we won't be allowed back into our apartment building for at least 10 days, possibly longer. I see, Eliza said, suddenly very aware of what this meant. Well, you and Sophie are welcome to stay at the house as long as you need to. Are you sure? That's a lot to ask. I'm sure, Eliza replied without hesitation. Actually, I've been thinking about it. I'm mostly staying at the house to sort through my mother's belongings and decide what to do with the property. Having you and Sophie there would be nice. There was a brief pause before Daniel spoke again. Thank you. I don't know what we would have done otherwise. How about I pick you up in an hour? Eliza suggested. I'm just finishing up here. After they ended the call, Eliza sat for a moment, reflecting on how quickly her life had changed in the span of 24 hours. She had gone from a solitary existence split between her apartment, the research center, and occasional nights at her mother's empty house to suddenly sharing that house with a man and his daughter who had been strangers yesterday morning. Strangely, it didn't feel as disruptive as it should have. Something about Daniel and Sophie's presence felt almost right. The thought both intrigued and alarmed her. She had built careful walls around her heart after her last relationship ended painfully 3 years ago, focusing entirely on her career and avoiding anything that might lead to emotional vulnerability. Yet here she was, offering indefinite shelter to a man who made her feel things she'd been avoiding for years. A man who, she reminded herself firmly, was still grieving his wife and focused entirely on raising his daughter. Whatever strange connection she felt to Daniel Walsh was surely one-sided and inappropriate given the circumstances. When she picked him up at the high school an hour later, Daniel looked exhausted but relieved. They've authorized emergency funds for displaced residents, he explained as they drove back toward the hillside. Not much, but enough to replace some essentials. Tomorrow they're organizing supervised visits to the flooded areas so people can retrieve important items if their homes are deemed structurally sound. That's good news, Eliza said. I'll need to do the same for my apartment. I could go with you, Daniel offered. Return the favor of your help today. Eliza glanced at him, touched by the offer. That would be nice, actually. Thank you. When they arrived back at the house, they found Sophie and Mrs. Holloway in the kitchen, baking cookies. The elderly woman had apparently brought over supplies from her own home, recognizing that comfort food might be exactly what was needed after the trauma of the flood. We made chocolate chip and oatmeal raisin, Sophie announced proudly, flour dusting her cheeks. Mrs. Holloway says baking is science and art mixed together. She's absolutely right, Eliza agreed, smiling at her neighbor, and it smells like your science experiment was a great success. After Mrs. Holloway departed with promises to return any time they needed her, the three of them settled into a quiet evening routine that felt surprisingly natural. Daniel insisted on cooking dinner, using ingredients he'd purchased at a small market that had reopened on the hillside. Sophie set the table with solemn care, placing each fork and napkin with deliberate precision. Eliza, despite her protests that she should help, was instructed to rest her injured shoulder and simply enjoy being served for once. As they ate the simple but delicious pasta dish Daniel had prepared, Eliza found herself studying her unexpected house guests. Sophie, animated once more after the trauma of the flood, chattered about the cookies and the drawing she had completed, her resilience remarkable for a child who had faced so much loss and danger in her young life. And Daniel. Eliza found her gaze drawn to him repeatedly throughout the meal. There was a quiet strength about him, a steadiness that seemed to anchor the room. When he smiled at something Sophie said, his entire face transformed, the weight of worry momentarily lifting from his features. Catching her watching him, Daniel raised an eyebrow in silent question. Eliza quickly looked away, focusing intently on her pasta. But later, as they cleaned up together while Sophie watched a cartoon in the living room, she felt his eyes on her with the same thoughtful intensity. Neither of them mentioned it, maintaining a careful distance as they moved around the kitchen. Yet something had shifted between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of awareness that hung in the air like the faintest hint of electricity before a storm. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the beautiful weather a stark contrast to the devastation still visible in the lower parts of town. Eliza woke early, her body accustomed to rising with the sun despite her restless sleep. Her dreams had been a confusing mix of rushing floodwaters and warm brown eyes watching her across a kitchen counter. She found Daniel already awake, sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee, gazing out at the view of the town and ocean beyond. He turned when he heard the door open, offering her a smile that made her heart skip unexpectedly. "Morning," he said softly. "There's fresh coffee in the kitchen. I hope you don't mind that I've made myself at home." "Not at all," Eliza replied, leaning against the doorframe. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected," Daniel admitted, "though I kept waking up to check on Sophie. She had a nightmare about the flood." Concern crossed Eliza's face. "Is she okay?" Daniel nodded. "She's resilient, more than I am sometimes." He looked back toward the view, his expression sobering. "They're letting people back into the flooded areas today to salvage what they can. I checked online and both our buildings are on the list for supervised re-entry." "What time?" Eliza asked, already mentally cataloging what she needed to retrieve from her apartment. 9 to 3. They're doing it in shifts to maintain safety." He hesitated, then added, "I was thinking we could go together, help each other out. Sophie can stay with Mrs. Holloway again if she's available." "I'd like that," Eliza said. The prospect of facing her waterlogged apartment alone had been daunting. Having Daniel there would make it easier somehow. By 8:30, they had dropped Sophie off with Mrs. Holloway, who had enthusiastically agreed to watch her again, promising baking projects and garden exploration to keep the little girl's mind off her worries. Sophie had hugged her father tightly before they left, whispering something in his ear that made him smile and nod reassuringly. As they drove down into town, the devastation became increasingly apparent. Mud-covered streets were lined with piles of debris as residents who had already been allowed to return began the heartbreaking process of discarding ruined possessions. Emergency vehicles and utility trucks were everywhere, workers in bright vests directing traffic around closed roads and hazardous areas. They stopped at Eliza's apartment building first. A National Guard soldier checked their IDs against a list, then escorted them inside, warning that they had 1 hour and to touch nothing electrical. The soldier remained in the lobby while they climbed the stairs to Eliza's second-floor apartment. The smell hit them first, a pungent mixture of mud, mildew, and rot. Eliza paused at her door, suddenly reluctant to see what lay beyond. Daniel's hand touched her shoulder gently, offering silent support. Taking a deep breath, she unlocked the door and pushed it open. Water had reached about 4 feet high in her apartment, leaving a distinct line of discoloration on the walls. Everything below that line was ruined, furniture warped and stained, books swollen with water, electronics destroyed. Mud covered the floors, and small personal items had been picked up by the floodwaters and deposited in strange places throughout the rooms. "Oh, Eliza," Daniel said softly, taking in the destruction. She moved forward mechanically, trying to detach herself emotionally from the scene. "It's just stuff," she said, her voice not entirely steady. "The important things are above the waterline." They worked methodically, Eliza directing Daniel to help her retrieve essential documents from a filing cabinet that had thankfully been placed on a high shelf. She packed clothes from her bedroom closet, family photographs that had been spared, and her laptop, which had been on her desk, safely above the flood level. In her home office, she carefully packed research notes and backup drives containing years of work. Daniel found waterproof containers in her kitchen to protect the items they were salvaging, working efficiently alongside her with minimal conversation needed. As Eliza reached for a framed photograph on a high bookshelf, her injured shoulder protested sharply, causing her to wince and drop her arm. "Let me," Daniel said immediately, stepping closer. He reached up and carefully removed the photograph, handing it to her. It showed a younger Eliza with an older woman who shared her eyes and smile, both of them laughing on a beach. "Your mother?" Daniel asked gently. Eliza nodded, her finger tracing the edge of the frame. "Taken about 5 years ago before she got sick." She looked up to find Daniel watching her, understanding in his eyes. "Cancer," she said simply, knowing he of all people would understand without further explanation. "It leaves a hole that never quite closes, doesn't it?" he said quietly. "Yes," Eliza agreed, "but eventually you learn to live with the hole. It becomes part of you." They stood there for a moment, connected by shared grief, before resuming their task. When they had gathered everything salvageable, they carried it out to the car, then drove to Daniel's apartment building across town. The scene at Daniel's building was similar: mud, water damage, the acrid smell of mildew. His ground-floor apartment had suffered worse flooding than Eliza's, with water reaching nearly to the ceiling. Almost nothing was salvageable except for items he had stored in high kitchen cabinets and a few things from the tops of closets. "Sophie's baby book," he said with visible relief, retrieving a plastic-wrapped album from the top shelf of his closet. "Rebecca was meticulous about recording everything from Sophie's first year. I was so worried it was destroyed." Eliza watched as he carefully placed the album in one of the containers they had brought. The tenderness with which he handled this memento of his late wife stirred something in her chest. Not jealousy, but admiration for his devotion to preserving Sophie's connection to her mother. "What about clothing for Sophie?" Eliza asked, noticing that most of the items they had salvaged were documents and mementos rather than practical necessities. Daniel's expression fell. "Everything in her room is ruined. Her favorite stuffed animals, her books." He ran a hand through his hair, the strain of the situation finally showing on his face. "How do I explain to a 6-year-old that all her treasured possessions are gone?" Without thinking, Eliza reached out and took his hand. "We'll figure it out together. There are donation centers being set up, and Sophie is more resilient than you think. She survived the flood. She'll survive this too." Daniel looked down at their joined hands, then back up to Eliza's face. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "For everything." The intensity in his eyes made Eliza suddenly aware of how close they were standing. She could feel the warmth of his hand in hers, see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. For a breathless moment, she thought he might move closer, but instead, he squeezed her hand once and then gently released it. "We should finish up here," he said, his voice returning to normal. "Our time is almost up." By the time they returned to the hillside home, both physically and emotionally drained from the morning's activities, it was early afternoon. They found Sophie in Mrs. Holloway's garden, happily helping the older woman plant flowers in colorful pots. "Daddy! Eliza!" Sophie called out when she saw them, rushing over with dirty hands and a bright smile. "Mrs. Holloway is teaching me how to make things grow. Can we plant flowers at your house too, Eliza?" Eliza smiled, touched by the child's enthusiasm despite everything that had happened. Of course we can. I think the garden could use some new flowers. While Daniel spoke with Mrs. Holloway, thanking her profusely for watching Sophie, Eliza knelt down to the little girl's level. Your dad and I went to both our apartments today. I'm afraid the water damaged a lot of things. Sophie's smile dimmed slightly. Even Mr. Whiskers? She asked, referring to what Eliza had learned was her favorite stuffed cat. I'm afraid so, Eliza said gently. But you know what? I think I might have something that could help. She held out her hand. Want to come see? Sophie nodded, slipping her small hand into Eliza's. They walked back to the house together, with Daniel following after bidding Mrs. Holloway goodbye. In the attic, Eliza pulled out a dusty box labeled Eliza Childhood. Inside, nestled among old books and games, was a well-loved stuffed otter, its fur worn smooth from years of cuddling. This is Otto, Eliza explained, holding the stuffed animal carefully. He was my special friend when I was just about your age. I took him everywhere with me, and he always made me feel safe when I was scared or sad. She held the otter out to Sophie. I think he'd like to be your friend now, if you'd like. Sophie's eyes widened as she took the stuffed animal, examining it with solemn care. Are you sure you want to give him to me? She asked, looking up at Eliza with serious eyes. Absolutely sure, Eliza replied. Otto is very brave, just like you, and he's very good at keeping away bad dreams. Sophie hugged the otter to her chest, a smile spreading across her face. Thank you, Eliza. I promise I'll take really good care of him. From the doorway, Daniel watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. When Eliza looked up and met his eyes, he didn't look away. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of the bonds forming between the three of them, for better or worse. That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, clutching Otto tightly, Daniel and Eliza sat on the back porch, sharing a bottle of wine they had found in the pantry. The night was clear, stars twinkling overhead, the distant sound of emergency vehicles in town, the only reminder of the ongoing crisis below. Sophie has really taken to you, Daniel said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. She's an easy child to care for, Eliza replied, so open and trusting despite everything she's been through. Daniel nodded, swirling the wine in his glass thoughtfully. That's what worries me sometimes, her openness, her willingness to attach to people. He glanced at Eliza. I don't want her to be hurt when things change again. Eliza understood what he was really saying, a gentle warning about the temporary nature of their current living arrangement, a reminder that someday soon they would return to their separate lives. The thought sent an unexpected pang through her chest. Children are adaptable, she said, trying to keep her voice light. And Sophie is stronger than most. Yes, she is, Daniel agreed. But it's not just Sophie I'm concerned about. He met her eyes directly. I've seen how you look at her, Eliza. The way you care for her already. I don't want either of you to get hurt when the time comes for us to move on. The honesty of his words caught her off guard. I know this is temporary, she said softly. I've always known that. Daniel studied her face in the dim light from the kitchen window. Has it occurred to you that maybe it doesn't have to be? Eliza's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? Before Daniel could respond, his phone rang, the emergency coordinator calling about a community meeting for flood victims scheduled for the following day. The moment, whatever it might have become, passed as Daniel took the call, walking to the other end of the porch for better reception. Eliza remained seated, her mind racing with the implications of his unfinished question. What had he meant? And more importantly, what did she want him to mean? The community center was packed to capacity, the buzz of anxious conversation filling the air as residents of Millhaven gathered for the emergency meeting. Eliza, Daniel, and Sophie found seats near the back, joining hundreds of other flood victims seeking information and assistance. Sophie sat between them, clutching Otto the otter to her chest, her eyes wide as she took in the crowd of worried faces. Mayor Thornton, a stout woman with silver hair and a commanding presence, stood at the podium, calling the meeting to order. The room gradually fell silent as she began to speak, outlining the current state of recovery efforts and the challenges that lay ahead. "The damage to our infrastructure is extensive," she explained, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words. "Water, power, and sewage systems in the affected areas will require significant repairs before residents can safely return. We're looking at weeks, not days, for the most severely impacted neighborhoods." A collective groan rose from the crowd. Daniel reached across Sophie to touch Eliza's arm, a gesture of solidarity in the face of this disappointing news. The brief contact sent a warm flutter through her chest, distracting her momentarily from the mayor's words. "The federal disaster declaration has been approved," Mayor Thornton continued, "which means additional resources are coming. FEMA representatives are here today to begin processing claims for temporary housing assistance." The meeting continued with various officials providing updates on utility restoration, road clearing, and health concerns related to contaminated floodwaters. When the floor opened for questions, the atmosphere grew tense as frustrated residents voiced their concerns, fears, and occasionally anger at what some perceived as inadequate preparation for the disaster. Eliza felt Sophie press closer to her side, the child's small body tense as voices around them grew louder and more emotional. Without thinking, she wrapped an arm around Sophie's shoulders, drawing her into a protective embrace. "It's okay," she whispered. "People are just scared and upset. That's normal after something like this happens." Sophie nodded, relaxing slightly against Eliza's side. Daniel watched them, his expression softening at the sight of his daughter finding comfort in Eliza's arms. When their eyes met over Sophie's head, something unspoken passed between them again: gratitude, understanding, and something deeper that neither was quite ready to name. After the meeting, they joined the long line of residents signing up for various assistance programs. Sophie grew restless, fidgeting between them as the wait stretched on. "I have an idea," Eliza said, kneeling down to Sophie's level. "See that park across the street? How about you and I go explore while your dad finishes up here? We can see if any of the playground survived the flood." Sophie looked to her father for permission. Daniel hesitated briefly, then nodded. "Stay where I can see you from the windows," he said. "I shouldn't be more than 20 minutes." The small park had escaped the worst of the flooding due to its slight elevation. Though muddy in places, the playground equipment stood intact, gleaming in the afternoon sun. Sophie's face lit up at the sight, her earlier anxiety forgotten as she ran toward the swings. "Push me, Eliza," she called, climbing onto the rubber seat. "I want to go super high." For the next 15 minutes, Eliza lost herself in Sophie's joy, pushing the swing higher as the little girl squealed with delight, her laughter a welcome counterpoint to the somber mood of the meeting they'd just left. When Sophie tired of the swings, they moved to the slide, then the monkey bars, where Eliza stood ready to catch her if she slipped. "My mommy used to bring me to the park," Sophie said unexpectedly as they sat on a bench taking a break, "before she got sick." Eliza felt her heart constrict at the casual mention of Rebecca. "Did she?" she asked gently. Sophie nodded, her legs swinging back and forth beneath the bench. "She was really good at the monkey bars. Daddy isn't. He says his arms are too long." "I bet your mommy was good at lots of things," Eliza said. "She was the best at bedtime stories," Sophie confirmed. "She did all the different voices. Daddy tries, but he's not as good." "No one can be good at everything," Eliza said, carefully navigating this delicate conversation. "But I bet your daddy is good at other things that your mommy wasn't." Sophie considered this, her small face serious. "Daddy makes better pancakes, and he can fix anything that breaks." She looked up at Eliza, her expression suddenly vulnerable. "Do you think my mommy would be mad that I like when you push me on the swings?" The question caught Eliza off guard, a lump forming in her throat. "Oh, Sophie, no. I think your mommy would be very happy that you're having fun and that you found someone else who likes to push you on the swings. Mommies want their children to be happy, even when they can't be there themselves." Sophie seemed satisfied with this answer, nodding solemnly before hopping off the bench. "Can we go on the seesaw now?" From across the street, Daniel watched them through the community center window, his heart a tangle of complicated emotions. Seeing Sophie so carefree with Eliza, laughing, playing, confiding in her, filled him with both gratitude and a strange, unexpected jealousy. Not jealousy directed at Eliza, but at the ease with which his daughter had formed this new bond when he himself still struggled to fill the maternal void in Sophie's life. And yet, watching Eliza with his daughter also stirred something else within him, a warmth, a longing, a tentative hope that perhaps, against all odds, they had found someone who could help heal the wounds left by Rebecca's absence. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. When he finally joined them in the park, having completed the necessary paperwork, he found them on the seesaw, Eliza and Sophie on opposite ends, both laughing as they pushed up and down. Something about the scene, the joy on his daughter's face, the sunlight catching in Eliza's hair, struck him with such force that he had to stop for a moment, just to breathe through the rush of emotion. "Daddy!" Sophie called, spotting him. "Come play with us!" The rest of the afternoon passed in a bubble of unexpected happiness, the three of them exploring the park together, momentarily setting aside the worries of flood damage, insurance claims, and uncertain futures. For a few precious hours, they were just a man, a woman, and a child enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company on a sunny afternoon. Later, as they drove back to the hillside house, Sophie fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the day's activities. In the quiet that settled between them, Eliza finally found the courage to address what Daniel had started to say the night before. "About what you said last night," she began, keeping her voice low so as not to wake Sophie. "About this arrangement not necessarily being temporary." Daniel's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "I shouldn't have said that," he replied, his voice equally quiet. "It was presumptuous of me." "I didn't think it was presumptuous," Eliza said. I wasn't sure what you meant exactly." Daniel was silent for a long moment, seemingly gathering his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, measured. "I meant that I've seen how good you are with Sophie, how quickly she's bonded with you, and I've felt—" He paused, choosing his next words with deliberate care. "I've felt something developing between us that I wasn't expecting. Something that might be worth exploring once things settle down." Eliza's heart beat faster at his admission. "I've felt it too," she confessed. "But I've been telling myself it's just the circumstances. The rescue, living together, going through this disaster side by side. Trauma can create false intimacy." "Is that what you think this is?" Daniel asked, glancing at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "False intimacy?" "I don't know," Eliza admitted. "I just know that I care about you and Sophie more than I should, considering how short a time we've known each other." "Maybe time isn't always the best measure," Daniel suggested. "Sometimes life compresses experiences in ways that accelerate connections. That doesn't necessarily make them less real." They lapsed into silence again, each absorbing the other's words, the implications hanging between them like delicate threads waiting to be either strengthened or broken. That evening, after Sophie was tucked into bed with Otto clutched tightly in her arms, Eliza found herself in her mother's study, surrounded by the familiar comfort of books and memories. The room had always been her refuge, a place where she could think clearly when life became complicated. Her mother's presence seemed especially strong tonight, as if the ghost of Eleanor Bennet was sitting in her favorite armchair, offering silent counsel. Eliza ran her fingers along the spines of well-worn novels on the bookshelf, seeking wisdom in their familiar titles. "What would you think of them, Mom?" she whispered to the empty room. Would you tell me I'm being foolish, opening my heart to a man who's still mourning his wife? To a child who already lost one mother?" No answer came, of course, but as she stood there in the quiet room, Eliza felt a sense of peace settle over her. Her mother had always taught her to follow her heart, even when the path it chose was difficult or uncertain. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Daniel stood in the doorway, 2 cups of tea in his hands. "I thought you might like some," he said, offering her one of the cups. "You seemed deep in thought when you came in here." "Thank you," Eliza said, accepting the cup gratefully. "I was just remembering my mother. This was her favorite room." Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Rebecca had a studio where she painted. After she died, I couldn't go in there for months. It was too full of her absence." "And now?" Eliza asked. "Now I can go in and feel her presence instead of her absence," Daniel replied. "It took time, but it happened." They sat together in the comfortable chairs by the window, sipping their tea in companionable silence, the shared understanding of loss creating a bridge between them. "Sophie asked me today if her mother would be mad that she likes when I push her on the swings," Eliza said eventually. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, pain flashing across his features. "What did you tell her?" "That her mother would want her to be happy, even if she couldn't be there herself." Eliza hesitated, then added, "I hope that was okay." "It was perfect," Daniel assured her, "and true. Rebecca would have liked you, I think. Your kindness, your intelligence, your honesty." He set his cup down, leaning forward slightly. "Sophie needs that in her life, and so do I." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Eliza felt her heart beating in her throat, the moment crystallizing around them. "Daniel," she began, unsure what she wanted to say but feeling that something needed to be acknowledged. "I know it's complicated," he said quietly. "I know the timing is all wrong. I'm still healing from losing Rebecca. You're dealing with your mother's loss. We're both displaced by the flood. And there's Sophie to consider in all of this." "Yes," Eliza agreed. "It's complicated. But life is complicated," Daniel continued. "And sometimes, rarely, in the middle of all that complexity, something simple and true appears." He reached across the space between their chairs, his hand open, an invitation rather than a demand. "I'm not asking for promises, Eliza. I'm just asking if you're willing to see where this might lead once the waters recede." Eliza looked at his outstretched hand, then up to his face, seeing the genuine emotion there, the careful hope, the respect for whatever boundaries she might need to establish. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her hand in his, their fingers intertwining with a sense of rightness that defied rational explanation. "I'd like that," she said softly. Outside, the distant sound of emergency vehicles continued as the town struggled to recover from the disaster. Inside, in the quiet sanctuary of Eleanor Bennett's study, 2 people who had found each other in the midst of chaos took the first tentative step toward something neither had been looking for, but both now recognized they needed. The days that followed took on a rhythm of their own, a new normal forming around the 3 of them as they navigated the aftermath of the flood together. Each morning, Daniel made breakfast while Eliza prepared coffee, their movements in the kitchen becoming a synchronized dance that required few words. Sophie would join them, usually clutching Otto, her sleep-tousled hair a halo around her bright face as she chattered about her dreams or plans for the day. During the day, Daniel worked remotely from Eleanor's study, coordinating with his engineering team on revised plans for the bridge project, which had taken on new urgency following the flood. Eliza split her time between the research center, where she was helping document the environmental impact of the disaster and assisting with community recovery efforts. Sophie, unable to return to her flood-damaged school, spent most days with Mrs. Holloway, who had set up an impromptu classroom for several displaced children in her spacious home. In the evenings, they would come together again, sharing meals and stories of their day. Often, they would end up on the back porch, watching the sunset over the slowly recovering town below, Daniel and Eliza sitting close enough that their hands could touch if either chose to bridge the small gap between them, which, increasingly, they did. It was in these quiet moments, with Sophie already asleep upstairs, that they began to learn each other's histories, piecing together the paths that had led them to this unexpected intersection of their lives. "I always wanted to be a marine biologist," Eliza told him one evening, a week after the flood. "Even as a little girl, I was fascinated by the ocean. My father was a fisherman. He died when I was 12, lost at sea during a storm." Daniel's hand found hers in the gathering darkness. "I'm sorry. That must have been devastating." "It was," Eliza acknowledged. "But in a way, it cemented my connection to the ocean. I wanted to understand it, respect it, protect it. My mother understood, even though I think she was terrified I'd meet the same fate as my father." "And Rebecca?" Eliza asked gently, knowing they needed to speak openly about his late wife if they were to move forward together. "What was she like?" A soft smile touched Daniel's lips, not of recent pain but of cherished memory. "Vibrant. That's the word that always comes to mind first. She filled every room she entered with energy and color, literally, sometimes. She was an artist, specialized in large-scale murals. That's how we met, actually. My firm was designing a public building, and she was commissioned to create a mural for the atrium." "She sounds remarkable," Eliza said sincerely. "She was," Daniel agreed. "And she would have liked you. Not just because you saved Sophie, but because of who you are. Thoughtful, passionate about your work. Kind." He squeezed her hand. "She always told me that if anything happened to her, she wanted Sophie and me to be happy, not locked in grief." "Wise woman," Eliza murmured. "Yes," Daniel said, "though it took me a long time to be able to honor that wish. Until recently, I couldn't imagine feeling anything but grief and responsibility towards Sophie." The implication of his words hung in the air between them, that something had changed, that she had somehow helped him begin to move beyond mere existence and back toward living. It was both a beautiful and terrifying realization, the weight of it settling around Eliza's shoulders like a mantle she wasn't entirely sure she was ready to bear. 2 weeks after the flood, they received notice that Daniel's apartment building had been deemed structurally unsound due to foundation damage. The contents of his apartment, what little might have been salvageable, were now permanently inaccessible as the building was slated for demolition. "I suppose we'll need to find a new place," Daniel said that evening, after sharing the news with Eliza. Sophie was upstairs getting ready for bed. The emergency housing assistant should cover a rental until insurance comes through. Eliza felt a sudden tightness in her chest at the thought of them leaving. In just 2 weeks, their presence had transformed the empty, grief-filled house into a home again. The sound of Sophie's laughter echoing through the hallways, Daniel's quiet presence in the study, the shared meals and conversations, all of it had become essential to her in a way she hadn't anticipated. "You don't have to go," she said, the words coming out more abruptly than she'd intended. "I mean, you're welcome to stay here. There's plenty of room, and it doesn't make sense to uproot Sophie again so soon." Daniel studied her face, his expression thoughtful. "Are you sure? We've already imposed on your hospitality for longer than either of us expected." "It's not an imposition," Eliza insisted. "It's—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's nice, having you both here. The house was too empty before, too full of ghosts. And now? Now it's full of life again," she said simply. The truth of her words hung between them, weighted with implications neither was quite ready to fully articulate. Daniel reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "Then we'll stay," he said. "For now." That night, after Sophie was asleep, Eliza found herself drawn to her mother's bedroom, which she had been using since returning to the house. Standing at the window, Looking out at the moonlit garden, she felt a complicated mix of emotions churning within her. Joy at the prospect of Daniel and Sophie remaining, fear of the growing attachment she felt toward both of them, uncertainty about where this unexpected path might lead. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Daniel stood in the doorway, his expression difficult to read in the dim light. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for everything. The roof over our heads, your kindness to Sophie, your—" He hesitated. "Your understanding of what I'm still working through." "You don't need to thank me," Eliza replied, turning to face him fully. "You've both brought something back to this house that I thought was gone forever." Daniel took a step into the room, then another, until he stood just an arm's length away from her. "And what's that?" "Hope," Eliza said softly. "A sense of possibility, of future." The word hung between them, laden with meaning. Eliza was acutely aware of his proximity, of the quiet intensity in his gaze as it held hers. Something was shifting between them, the careful boundaries they had maintained beginning to blur. Daniel reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she chose, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His touch was gentle, questioning, and Eliza found herself leaning into it slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "Eliza," he said, her name almost a whisper on his lips. "I don't want to complicate things between us before either of us is ready. But I need you to know that what I'm feeling for you is real. It's not gratitude or convenience or trauma bonding. It's something I didn't expect to feel again, something I wasn't looking for." "I feel it too," she admitted, her voice barely audible even in the quiet room. "And it terrifies me. The potential for pain, not just for us, but for Sophie." "I know," Daniel said. "That's why we need to be sure, to move slowly, to be certain before we take any steps that can't be undone." Eliza nodded, understanding and appreciating his caution even as a part of her longed to close the remaining distance between them. "Slowly," she agreed. Daniel's hand moved to cup her cheek, his touch feather-light. "But that doesn't mean we can't acknowledge what's happening, what we both feel." "No," Eliza said, "it doesn't mean that." For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and found herself both hoping for and dreading that possibility. Instead, Daniel leaned forward and pressed his lips gently to her forehead, a gesture so tender and respectful that Eliza felt tears spring to her eyes. "Good night, Eliza," he said softly, stepping back. "Good night, Daniel." After he left, Eliza remained by the window for a long time, her fingers touching the spot where his lips had been, her heart full of a cautious joy she hadn't felt in years. The next morning brought a new challenge. Sophie woke with a fever, her small face flushed and her normally bright eyes glassy with illness. Daniel, immediately concerned, called the pediatrician who had set up a temporary clinic in the community center. "They can see her at 11, he reported, hanging up the phone. "They think it might be an infection from exposure to the floodwaters." Eliza, who had been preparing to leave for the research center, immediately changed her plans. "I'll come with you," she said, already texting Dr. Chen to let him know she wouldn't be in. Daniel looked momentarily surprised, then grateful. "You don't have to do that." "I want to," Eliza replied simply. "Unless you'd prefer to go alone?" "No," Daniel said, relief evident in his voice. "Having you there would be helpful. Sophie trusts you." The pediatrician confirmed their fears. Sophie had developed a bacterial infection, likely from contact with contaminated floodwater. Though not serious if treated promptly, it would require a course of antibiotics and close monitoring for the next few days. "She'll need to stay hydrated and get plenty of rest," Dr. Patel explained, writing out a prescription. "The fever may spike before it breaks, which can be frightening, but it's normal. If it goes above 103 degrees, bring her back immediately." Throughout the examination, Sophie had clung to Eliza's hand as much as her father's, seeking comfort from both adults in her life. Now, as they prepared to leave, she looked up at Eliza with trust and vulnerability that made Eliza's heart ache. "Will you help take care of me?" Sophie asked, her voice small and raspy from her sore throat. "Of course I will," Eliza promised, smoothing the child's hair back from her hot forehead. "Your dad and I will both take care of you. You'll feel better soon, I promise." Over the next 2 days, they took turns sitting with Sophie, administering medication, encouraging fluids, and providing comfort. Daniel handled the night shifts, insisting that Eliza needed her rest, but during the day, she took over so he could continue working on his project, which had critical deadlines that couldn't be postponed even for a family emergency. Family. The word slipped into Eliza's thoughts unbidden as she sat beside Sophie's bed, reading aloud from a book of children's stories she had found in the attic. Was that what they were becoming? A family forged in crisis, bound together by circumstance and growing affection? On the second night of Sophie's illness, her fever spiked dramatically. Eliza, who had insisted on taking a turn watching over the child so Daniel could get some much-needed sleep, felt her heart race with panic as she placed a cool cloth on Sophie's burning forehead. "Daniel," she called, her voice tight with worry. "Daniel, her fever's worse." He appeared in the doorway almost instantly, as if he hadn't been sleeping at all but waiting just outside. One look at Sophie's flushed face and labored breathing sent him rushing to her side. 1035, Eliza reported, showing him the thermometer. "And rising. We need to get her to the clinic." Daniel gathered Sophie in his arms, wrapping her in a light blanket despite the heat radiating from her small body. Eliza grabbed her keys and led the way to the car, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios even as she tried to project calm for both Daniel and Sophie's sake. The drive to the emergency clinic was tense, filled with Sophie's whimpers and Daniel's quiet reassurances. Eliza drove as quickly as she safely could, one hand on the wheel, the other reaching back occasionally to touch Sophie's leg, offering whatever comfort she could. At the clinic, they were taken back immediately, the pediatrician on call quickly assessing Sophie's condition. "Her body is fighting the infection, but it's overwhelming her system," Dr. Patel explained after examining Sophie. "We need to start IV antibiotics immediately and bring this fever down." Eliza felt her stomach clench with fear as she watched the medical team work on Sophie, inserting an IV line into her small arm and attaching monitors to track her vital signs. Daniel stood rigid beside the examination table, his face a mask of controlled panic as he held his daughter's free hand. "Is she going to be okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Patel's expression was serious but not grim. "Children are remarkably resilient. The IV antibiotics are much stronger than the oral medication she was taking, and they'll work faster. I'm optimistic, but we need to monitor her closely for the next few hours." Sophie was transferred to a small observation room, one of several set up in the community center to handle medical emergencies in the aftermath of the flood. The regular hospital was still operating at reduced capacity due to water damage to its first floor, leaving the makeshift clinic to handle all but the most critical cases. "I'll stay with her," Daniel said, taking a seat in the chair beside Sophie's bed. "You should go home and get some rest." Eliza shook her head firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." Daniel looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, more complex. "Eliza, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she interrupted gently. "I want to. We're in this together, remember?" A nurse brought in another chair, and Eliza settled beside Daniel, both of them keeping vigil as Sophie's fever raged on. The hours blurred together in the dimly lit room, marked only by the regular visits from medical staff checking Sophie's temperature and vital signs. Around 3 a.m., Sophie became restless, thrashing weakly against the sheets, her eyes moving rapidly beneath closed lids as fever dreams gripped her. "Mommy," she whimpered. "I want Mommy." Daniel's face crumpled at his daughter's plea, a pain so raw and helpless that Eliza felt it like a physical blow. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "Talk to her," Eliza encouraged softly. "Let her hear your voice. It will anchor her." Daniel nodded, swallowing hard before leaning closer to his daughter. "Sophie, sweetheart, Daddy's here," he murmured, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I'm right here with you. You're going to be okay." Sophie's restless movements calmed slightly at the sound of her father's voice, but she continued to call for her mother in a heartbreaking litany that seemed to drain the color from Daniel's face with each repetition. In a moment of pure instinct, Eliza began to hum softly, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her when she was ill as a child. The simple melody filled the quiet room, providing a gentle counterpoint to the beeping monitors. Daniel looked at her with surprise, then gratitude, as Sophie's agitation visibly decreased. "That's beautiful," he whispered when Eliza paused. "What is it?" "An old sea chanty my father used to sing," Eliza explained. "My mother always hummed it to me when I was sick." "She likes it," Daniel observed, watching as Sophie's breathing became more even. Would you keep going?" Eliza nodded, resuming the melody, this time adding the soft words her father had taught her long ago. A sailor's prayer for safe harbor, for the storm to pass, for the stars to guide the way home. As she sang, Daniel's hand remained firmly in hers, their fingers intertwined in mutual support and shared concern. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, exhaustion finally overtook them both. Eliza woke with a start to find her head resting on Daniel's shoulder, his cheek pressed against her hair, both of them having drifted off in their uncomfortable chairs. The pale light of dawn filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the small room. She lifted her head carefully, not wanting to wake Daniel, and looked toward the bed. Sophie lay peacefully now, her breathing deep and regular. The flush of fever faded from her cheeks. Relief washed over Eliza as she gently disentangled her hand from Daniel's and stood to stretch her stiff muscles. Dr. Patel entered a few minutes later, her face brightening as she checked Sophie's vital signs. "Her fever broke during the night," she confirmed, "and her blood pressure has stabilized. I think we've turned a corner." Daniel, awakened by the doctor's entrance, rubbed his face and stood quickly. "So she's going to be okay?" "I believe so," Dr. Patel said with a smile. "We'll want to continue the IV antibiotics for a few more hours, and she'll need to complete the full course of medication at home, but children tend to bounce back quickly once the fever breaks." The relief in the room was palpable, a weight lifting from both their shoulders. Daniel turned to Eliza and, without a word, pulled her into a tight embrace. She felt his body shudder slightly against hers, the release of tension and fear that he had been holding in check for Sophie's sake. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for being here, for everything." Eliza closed her eyes, allowing herself to lean into his strength, to absorb the warmth of his gratitude and the unspoken emotions that flowed between them. "Always," she promised, the word a vow she hadn't known she was ready to make until it passed her lips. Sophie woke an hour later, weak but alert, her eyes brightening when she saw both Eliza and her father at her bedside. "Did I have to go to the hospital?" she asked, looking around the unfamiliar room with curiosity rather than fear. "Not quite a hospital, sweetheart," Daniel explained, smoothing her tangled hair. "But yes, you needed some special medicine to help you feel better." "Did you take care of me?" Sophie asked, her gaze moving between the two adults. "We both did," Eliza said, smiling gently at the child. "Your dad and I have been here all night, making sure you were okay." Sophie considered this for a moment, then asked with the directness only a child could manage, "Like a mommy and daddy both take care of their kids?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications that neither adult had been prepared to address so explicitly. Daniel's eyes met Eliza's over Sophie's head, a silent communication passing between them. "Yes," Daniel said finally, his voice soft but certain. "Very much like that." The simple affirmation sent a wave of emotion through Eliza: hope, fear, joy, and a sense of rightness that defied rational explanation. She reached out to touch Sophie's hand, choosing her words carefully. "Families come in all different forms, Sophie," she said. "What matters is that the people in them love each other and take care of each other." Sophie nodded, seeming satisfied with this answer. "I'm hungry," she announced, changing subjects with the lightning speed of childhood. "Can I have pancakes?" Daniel laughed, the sound rich with relief. "Maybe not pancakes just yet, Bug. Let's see what the doctor says you can eat first." By mid-afternoon, Sophie was discharged with instructions for continued care at home. She was still weak, needing to be carried to the car, but the worst had passed. As they drove back to the hillside house, Eliza glanced in the rearview mirror at Sophie, who was already dozing in her car seat, Otto clutched tightly to her chest. "She scared me," Daniel admitted quietly from the passenger seat. "I haven't been that frightened since Rebecca got sick?" Eliza supplied gently when he trailed off. Daniel nodded. "For a moment there, I thought I might lose her too. I don't think I could survive that." "But you didn't lose her," Eliza reminded him. "She's right there, getting stronger by the hour." "Because of you," Daniel said, turning to look at her profile as she drove. "You knew something was wrong. You were the one who insisted we take her to the clinic right away." "We both knew," Eliza corrected. "We both took care of her." The significance of her words, echoing Sophie's earlier question, wasn't lost on either of them. A fragile silence settled between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Back at the house, they settled Sophie in her bed, surrounded by pillows and with a fresh glass of water on the nightstand. The child was already drifting back to sleep, the excitement of returning home having depleted her limited energy. "Rest now," Daniel whispered, kissing her forehead. "Daddy will be right downstairs if you need anything." "Eliza too?" Sophie asked drowsily, her eyes already closing. "Yes, sweetheart," Eliza assured her, adjusting the blankets. "I'll be here too." Once Sophie was asleep, they retreated downstairs, both suddenly aware of their own exhaustion after the long night of worry. In the kitchen, Eliza put on a pot of coffee while Daniel called his office to explain his continued absence. "I'll need at least another day or two at home with her," he was saying as Eliza placed a steaming mug in front of him. "Yes, I can review the revised plans remotely, but site visits will have to wait." After he hung up, Daniel rubbed his eyes tiredly. The bridge project is falling behind schedule. The flood damage was worse than initially assessed, and we're having to redesign significant portions. "Is your job at risk?" Eliza asked, concerned. Daniel shook his head. "No, nothing like that. The project is still fully funded and considered essential infrastructure. It's just adding pressure at a time when I'm already stretched thin." He looked up at her, his expression softening. "But Sophie comes first. Always." "Of course she does," Eliza agreed. "And you don't have to handle everything alone. I've already called Dr. Chen and arranged to work from home for the rest of the week. I can help with Sophie while you focus on the redesign." Daniel's expression was a mixture of gratitude and something that looked almost like wonder. "You would do that? Haven't we established by now that I would do just about anything for you two?" Eliza said, trying to keep her tone light despite the weight of truth behind her words. Daniel reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Eliza, I need to tell you something. Something I've been feeling but haven't said aloud because it seemed too soon, too complicated." Eliza's heart quickened, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "When Sophie asked if we were taking care of her like a mommy and daddy, I answered honestly. Because that's what this feels like to me, like we're becoming a family. Not a replacement for what she lost with Rebecca, but something new, something different but equally valuable." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I'm falling in love with you, Eliza. I wasn't looking for it, wasn't expecting it, but there it is, and it terrifies me." because the last time I loved someone this deeply, I lost her." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Eliza felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by both his admission and the echo of her own unspoken feelings. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered, her voice catching slightly. "With both of you, and it terrifies me for all the same reasons. What if it doesn't work? What if Sophie gets hurt? What if—" Daniel moved from his chair to kneel beside hers, taking both her hands in his. "Life doesn't come with guarantees, Eliza. We both know that better than most. But what I feel for you is real and true and worth the risk." "Worth the risk," Eliza repeated softly, the words settling into her heart with the weight of decision. Slowly, deliberately, she leaned forward until her forehead rested against his. "Yes," she whispered. "You're worth the risk. Both of you." The kiss, when it finally came, was gentle, a beginning rather than a culmination, a promise of more to come. Daniel's hands cradled her face with infinite tenderness, as if she were something precious and fragile. Eliza's fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, anchoring herself to this moment, to this man who had somehow become essential to her happiness in so short a time. When they parted, both slightly breathless, Daniel smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed his tired face. "So where do we go from here?" he asked. "Forward," Eliza replied simply. "Together, one day at a time." The following days unfolded in a cocoon of domestic tranquility. Sophie recovered steadily, her strength returning a little more each day. Eliza worked from home, setting up a temporary office in the sunroom where she could analyze data from the research center while keeping an ear out for Sophie's calls. Daniel split his time between caring for his daughter and working on revised bridge designs at the antique desk in Eleanor's study. In the evenings they would gather in the living room, Sophie on the floor with coloring books or puzzles, Eliza and Daniel on the couch, their shoulders touching, fingers occasionally intertwining when Sophie wasn't looking. They were taking things slowly for Sophie's sake, careful not to overwhelm her with too much change too quickly. But the connection between them grew stronger with each passing day, each shared smile, each quiet conversation after Sophie had gone to bed. A week after Sophie's illness, Eliza came downstairs one morning to find Daniel on the phone, his expression serious as he paced the kitchen. "Yes, I understand the urgency," he was saying, "but my daughter has been ill and I can't just—" He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "Tomorrow? That's very short notice, but I suppose I could—" Another pause. "Yes, all right. I'll be there. Thank you for understanding." As he hung up, he noticed Eliza in the doorway and offered her a tired smile. "Morning. Everything okay?" she asked, moving to pour herself a cup of the coffee he had already made. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "That was my project manager. There's been another issue with the bridge site, something about soil composition that wasn't in the original surveys. They need me on site tomorrow for an emergency assessment." "In Millhaven?" Eliza asked. "No, that's the problem. It's at the main office in Portland. They need me there in person to review the core samples and revised geological surveys." He looked genuinely torn. "It's just for the day, but I hate to leave Sophie when she's still recovering." "Sophie is almost back to her normal self," Eliza pointed out gently, "and I'll be here with her. We'll be fine for one day." Daniel looked at her, gratitude and something deeper filling his eyes. "Are you sure? It's a lot to ask." "It's not asking when I'm offering," Eliza replied with a smile. "Besides, Sophie and I have plans to start a garden project. Mrs. Holloway gave us some seedlings yesterday." The tension in Daniel's shoulders eased visibly. "You're amazing, you know that?" "So you keep telling me," Eliza teased, stepping closer to him, "but I don't mind hearing it again." Daniel pulled her into his arms, pressing a soft kiss to her lips. "Thank you," he murmured against her mouth. for making all of this easier, for making everything better." Eliza melted into the embrace, still marveling at how right it felt to be held by him, to share these quiet moments of affection that had quickly become essential to her happiness. They were still learning each other, still discovering the contours of this new relationship, but every day brought deeper understanding, stronger connection. When Sophie came downstairs a few minutes later, they separated naturally, without awkwardness or guilt. They had decided to be honest with Sophie about the changing nature of their relationship, but to introduce the concept gradually, allowing her time to adjust to the idea that her father and Eliza cared for each other in a special way. "How are you feeling this morning, sweetheart?" Daniel asked as Sophie climbed onto a kitchen chair. "Good," she replied, reaching for the glass of orange juice Eliza had poured for her. "Can we plant the flowers today like Mrs. Holloway said?" "Absolutely," Eliza agreed, placing a bowl of oatmeal in front of the child. "I thought we could start after breakfast." Daniel watched the easy interaction between them, his heart full. "Sophie, I need to tell you something," he said, taking a seat beside his daughter. "I have to go away for work tomorrow, just for one day. I'll be back before bedtime." Sophie's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "Where are you going?" "Portland. It's not far, just a couple of hours away. I need to meet with some other engineers about the bridge project." Sophie considered this information, her small brow furrowing. "Who will stay with me?" "Eliza will," Daniel replied. "If that's okay with you?" Sophie's face brightened immediately. "Yes! We can plant our garden and make cookies and maybe finish my puzzle." Eliza and Daniel exchanged smiles over the child's head, both touched by her enthusiasm and trust. The next morning, Daniel left early, kissing Sophie goodbye with promises to call during his lunch break and to be home in time to read her bedtime story. He kissed Eliza too, more briefly but with undisguised affection, whispering, "I'll miss you," against her ear in a way that made her cheeks flush. Eliza and Sophie spent the morning in the garden, planting colorful annuals in the flower beds that had been neglected since Eleanor's illness. Sophie took her responsibility as assistant gardener very seriously, carefully patting soil around each fragile stem as Eliza showed her. "My mommy liked flowers too," Sophie said unexpectedly as they worked side by side. "She painted them sometimes." Eliza nodded, always careful when Sophie brought up Rebecca. "What kind of flowers did she like best?" "Sunflowers?" Sophie replied without hesitation. "Great big ones that were taller than me. We grew them in our old backyard before she got sick." "Sunflowers are wonderful," Eliza agreed. "Maybe we could plant some here too. There's plenty of sunny spots where they would grow well." Sophie's face lit up. "Really? Daddy would like that. He misses Mommy's sunflowers." "Then we definitely should plant some," Eliza said. "We can go to the garden center tomorrow and pick out some seeds." They were putting away the gardening tools when Eliza's phone rang. Not Daniel as she had expected, but Dr. Chen from the research center. "Eliza, I'm sorry to bother you at home," he began, his tone immediately alerting her that something was wrong. "But we've detected some concerning readings in the harbor water samples. The bacterial levels are far higher than they should be at this stage of flood recovery. I think we may have a significant sewage leak that wasn't identified in the initial infrastructure assessment." Eliza's mind immediately shifted to scientific mode, processing the implications. "Have you notified the health department?" "Yes, they're sending someone, but they're stretched thin with all the flood response. They asked if you could meet their inspector at the harbor to review the findings and help identify potential sources. Your knowledge of the local coastal topology would be invaluable." Eliza glanced at Sophie, who was carefully washing soil from her small hands at the garden hose. "I have Sophie with me today, Marcus. Daniel is in Portland for work." "Bring her along," Dr. Chen suggested. "It would just be a quick visual inspection of the harbor area, nothing dangerous. We need to move on this quickly, Eliza. If there's a major sewage leak into the harbor, it could have devastating environmental consequences, not to mention the public health risk." Eliza weighed her options. The inspection shouldn't take long, and the harbor area had been one of the first places cleared after the flood. Sophie might even enjoy the outing after being confined to the house during her illness. "All right," she decided, "we'll meet the inspector there in an hour." After calling Daniel and leaving a voicemail explaining the situation when he didn't answer, Eliza helped Sophie change into clean clothes and explained their mission in terms the child could understand. They were going to help make sure the ocean stayed clean for all the fish and sea creatures. "Like ocean doctors?" Sophie asked as they drove toward the harbor. Eliza smiled at the comparison. "Yes, exactly like ocean doctors. We need to find where some yucky stuff might be getting into the water and help stop it." The harbor area was a hive of activity as they arrived, with crews working to repair damaged piers and clear debris that had been carried in by the floodwaters. Eliza spotted the health department inspector, a harried-looking woman in her 50s with a clipboard and sample kit, waiting near the public boat launch. "Dr. Bennett, I'm Gloria Jenkins from County Health," she introduced herself, then noticed Sophie. "And who's this young lady?" "Sophie Walsh," Eliza said. "She's helping me today." The inspector smiled briefly at the child before turning back to business. "We've got potential contamination at 3 points around the harbor. Your colleague Dr. Chen suggested you might know if there are any sewer outflows or treatment facilities that could have been compromised by the flood." For the next 45 minutes, Eliza and the inspector walked the harbor perimeter, Sophie trailing along beside them, occasionally stopping to examine interesting shells or stones she found along the way. Eliza pointed out several locations where underground infrastructure might have been damaged, making notes on a map the inspector provided. They were just finishing up when Sophie, who had wandered a few feet away to look at a tide pool, suddenly cried out, "Eliza, look!" Eliza turned to see Sophie pointing excitedly at something in the water. Moving quickly to the child's side, she looked where Sophie was indicating and felt her heart skip a beat. A small harbor seal pup was struggling weakly on a rocky outcropping just offshore, visibly thin and distressed. "It's hurt," Sophie said, her voice filled with concern. "We have to help it." Eliza knelt beside Sophie, assessing the situation. The seal pup was indeed in trouble, likely separated from its mother during the flood and now struggling to survive on its own. "We can't touch it ourselves," Eliza explained gently. "Wild animals need special care from people who are trained to help them. But we can call the Marine Mammal Rescue Center right away." While the inspector continued her work, Eliza made the call, providing precise coordinates and a description of the pup's condition. The rescue center promised to send a team immediately. "Will they make it better?" Sophie asked anxiously as they waited, her eyes never leaving the struggling pup. "They'll do everything they can," Eliza assured her. "The people at the rescue center are very good at helping sick seals." When the Marine Mammal Rescue Team arrived 20 minutes later, Sophie watched with fascination as they carefully captured the weakened pup and performed a preliminary examination. "Female, approximately 3 weeks old, severely dehydrated and underweight," the lead rescuer reported. "But she's a fighter. Good chance of recovery with proper care." "Can we visit her?" Sophie asked immediately, "to make sure she's okay?" The rescuer smiled at Sophie's concern. "Once she's stabilized, absolutely. In fact, if she recovers well, we might need volunteers to help with her rehabilitation." Sophie's eyes widened with excitement. "I could help? Really?" "With adult supervision," the rescuer clarified, glancing at Eliza. "We always need gentle hands to help with feeding and socialization." By the time they returned to the hillside house late that afternoon, Sophie could talk of nothing but the seal pup and her plans to help with its recovery. When Daniel called to check in, she recounted the entire adventure in breathless detail. "And they said I can help feed her when she's stronger," she concluded triumphantly. "That sounds amazing, Bug," Daniel's voice came through the speaker. "I can't wait to hear all about it when I get home tonight." After Sophie handed the phone back to Eliza and ran upstairs to draw a picture of the seal pup, Daniel's tone grew more serious. Are you okay? That was more excitement than I expected for a quiet day at home. We're fine, Eliza assured him. It was actually wonderful to see Sophie so engaged and passionate about helping the seal. She has a natural empathy for animals. Like someone else I know, Daniel said warmly. Thank you for turning what could have been a boring work task into an educational adventure for her. Daniel returned late that evening, looking exhausted but relieved to be home. Sophie had already fallen asleep, the excitement of the day and her still recovering body requiring more rest than usual. Eliza met him at the door, welcoming him with a warm embrace that he sank into gratefully. Rough day? She asked, leading him to the kitchen where she had kept dinner warm. Challenging, he admitted, dropping his briefcase by the table. The soil composition at the main support site is more unstable than we initially thought. We're having to completely redesign the foundation structure. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. But I don't want to talk about bridges right now. I want to hear more about this seal pup adventure. As Daniel ate, Eliza recounted the day's events in greater detail, describing Sophie's immediate connection to the stranded seal and her determination to help with its rehabilitation. She's got your heart, Daniel said with a smile, that instinct to rescue creatures in distress. I think she's got plenty of your heart too, Eliza replied. That quiet determination, the way she focuses completely on what matters to her. Daniel reached across the table for her hand. I missed you today, he said simply. Both of you. It's strange how quickly this has become home, not just the house, but being with you and Sophie, the three of us together. I know, Eliza agreed softly. I felt it too when you were gone, like something essential was missing. Later, as they sat together on the porch, watching the distant lights of the recovering town below, Daniel broached a subject they had been circling for days. The city's housing authority called today, he said. They've found an available apartment for us in the new development on the east side. It's ready for immediate occupancy. Eliza felt her heart sink, though she tried not to let it show on her face. She had known this moment would come eventually, when Daniel and Sophie would no longer need the shelter of her mother's house, when they would return to their own independent lives. Despite their growing relationship, they had never explicitly discussed long-term living arrangements. I see, she said carefully. When would you need to make a decision? They want an answer by the end of the week, Daniel replied, his eyes studying her face. But I've already made my decision. I turned it down. Eliza's head snapped up in surprise. You did? But I thought… I know we haven't talked about this directly, Daniel continued, turning to face her fully. And if I'm moving too fast, you need to tell me. But Eliza, I don't want to leave this house. I don't want to leave you. Unless you want us to go, I'd like to stay. Not as temporary guests riding out a disaster, but as… He hesitated, searching for the right words. As family, Eliza finished for him, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Daniel said, relief evident in his expression. As family. The word hung between them, weighted with significance and promise. Eliza felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, unexpected emotion welling up from deep within. I don't want you to go either, she admitted. The thought of this house without you and Sophie in it, it doesn't feel right anymore. Daniel's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. He pulled her gently into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey, familiar and new all at once, full of promise and belonging. There's something else I need to tell you, he said when they finally broke apart. My firm has offered me a permanent position here in Millhaven, overseeing the bridge project through completion and then heading up a new coastal infrastructure division. They were going to wait until the emergency phase was over to discuss it, but with the redesign issues, they needed a commitment now. And you said yes? Eliza asked, already knowing the answer from the certainty in his eyes. I said yes, Daniel confirmed. Millhaven is our home now, Sophie's and mine. She's happy here. happier than I've seen her since before Rebecca got sick. And I've found something here I never expected to find again. His hand cupped her cheek tenderly. Someone I never expected to find. The next morning brought sunshine and the excited chatter of Sophie, who had awakened full of energy and plans for the day. Over breakfast, Daniel carefully broached the subject of their living arrangement. "Sophie, Eliza, and I have been talking," he began, meeting his daughter's curious gaze. "You know how we've been staying here since the flood?" Sophie nodded, taking another bite of her toast. "Because our apartment got all yucky with water." "That's right. Well, we could move to a new apartment now, one that's not damaged. Or," he glanced at Eliza, who nodded encouragingly, "we could keep living here with Eliza. Not just for a little while, but for a long time. What do you think about that?" Sophie's chewing slowed as she considered this option, her small face serious with thought. "Would it be our house too? Not just visiting?" "Yes," Eliza answered, her heart in her throat. "It would be your house too. You could pick new colors for your room, plant whatever you want in the garden. It would be home for all of us." "And would you and Daddy be like—" Sophie paused, searching for the concept. "Like a mommy and daddy together? Like Jamie's parents at school?" Daniel reached for Eliza's hand under the table, squeezing it gently. "Yes, sweetheart. Eliza and I care about each other very much in a special way. Not exactly the same as how I loved your mom, that was special and different, but still very important and real." Sophie nodded again, processing this information with remarkable composure for a 6-year-old. "So Eliza would be like my new mommy?" Eliza felt her breath catch. They hadn't discussed this specific aspect, hadn't put that particular label on what her relationship to Sophie might become. Before she could formulate a response, Daniel spoke, his voice gentle but clear. "Eliza would be her own special person in your life, Sophie. No one can replace your mom, and no one wants to. But Eliza loves you very much, and she would be another grown-up who would always take care of you and be there for you. Some kids are lucky enough to have lots of people who love them in different ways." Sophie turned her solemn gaze to Eliza. "Do you love me?" The directness of the question, delivered with such innocent vulnerability, brought tears to Eliza's eyes. "Yes, Sophie, I do. Very much." A smile spread across Sophie's face, brightening the kitchen like a sunrise. "Then I want to stay here, and I want you to be with my daddy, and I want to help the seal pup and plant sunflowers and make this our home." The simplicity of her acceptance, the unquestioning openness of her heart, was humbling. Eliza found herself unable to speak past the lump in her throat, overwhelmed by the trust this child was placing in her. "That settles it then," Daniel said, his own voice suspiciously rough with emotion. "We're staying." That afternoon they visited the Marine Mammal Rescue Center together, Sophie barely containing her excitement as they were led to the rehabilitation area where the seal pup was being kept. The small creature looked markedly better than the day before, more alert, though still weak and underweight. "We've named her Hope," the caretaker explained as Sophie pressed her face against the viewing window. "She's responding well to treatment, but she has a long recovery ahead." "When can I help?" Sophie asked immediately. "We start volunteer training next week," the caretaker said with a smile. "For now, the best thing you can do is visit. Seals are social creatures, and having regular visitors helps with their rehabilitation." As they watched Hope take a small amount of formula from a feeding tube, Eliza felt Daniel's arm slip around her waist, drawing her close to his side. The gesture felt natural, right, as if they had been standing together like this for years rather than weeks. "She's going to be okay," Sophie declared with absolute certainty, watching the seal pup. "She just needs a family to love her until she's strong enough to go back to the ocean." Eliza exchanged a look with Daniel, both recognizing the parallel to their own situation, how they had come together in crisis, finding strength and healing in the family they were creating together. On their way home, they stopped at the garden center to purchase sunflower seeds as promised. Sophie selected several varieties, from giant mammoth sunflowers to smaller, multicolored ornamental types. The owner of the center, recognizing them as flood survivors, insisted on adding several additional packets of flower and vegetable seeds to their purchase at no charge. "Everyone's pitching in to help Millhaven bloom again," she explained with a warm smile. "And it sounds like you've got the perfect garden for these beauties to thrive in." That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink over the slowly recovering town, the three of them sat on the back porch planning their garden. Sophie, paper and crayons spread before her, was drawing an elaborate map of where each type of flower and vegetable would go. "The sunflowers will go here," she explained, pointing to a sunny spot along the fence. "So Mommy can see them from heaven, and the vegetables will be over here, and we can make soup when they grow. And we need a special place for flowers that butterflies like because butterflies are important." Eliza watched her with a full heart, marveling at the resilience of children, at Sophie's ability to honor her mother's memory while still embracing the new life unfolding before her. Daniel's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with familiar ease. "Are you happy?" he asked softly, his eyes searching hers. Eliza considered the question, looking out at the view that had been her mother's favorite. The town nestled between hills and ocean, the vast expanse of water stretching to the horizon, the garden that would soon be filled with sunflowers and vegetables and butterfly-friendly blooms. Then she looked back at the man beside her and the child who was carefully coloring a rainbow over her garden plan, both of whom had come into her life so unexpectedly, bringing with them challenges and joy in equal measure. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she answered honestly. "This isn't the life I imagined for myself, but it's the one I want, with both of you." "It's the one we want too," Daniel replied, lifting her hand to press a kiss against her palm. "Our family, our home, our future, together." In the garden below, the first green shoots of recovery were already pushing through the soil, new life emerging from the earth that had been washed clean by the flood. Like the town rebuilding below, like Hope the seal pup gaining strength day by day, like the sunflowers that would soon reach toward the sky, they too were growing toward something beautiful, a family forged in crisis, but flourishing in love. 3 months had passed since the flood that changed everything. Summer had arrived in Millhaven, bringing warm breezes, tourists returning to the rebuilt shops downtown, and a sense of renewal that permeated the recovering coastal town. The physical scars of the disaster were fading, debris cleared away, damaged buildings repaired or demolished, new construction rising from mud-stained foundations. At the hillside house, the garden was in full bloom. Sunflowers stretched toward the sky, their massive yellow faces following the sun's path across the summer blue. Vegetables flourished in neat rows, tended daily by small hands that had grown increasingly confident in their gardening skills. Butterflies and bees drifted lazily from flower to flower in the special butterfly garden Sophie had insisted on creating, complete with a small bench where she could sit and watch her winged visitors. Eliza stood at the kitchen window, watching as Sophie carefully harvested peas from vines that climbed a trellis Daniel had built. The transformation in the little girl over the past months had been remarkable. From the terrified child clinging to a lamppost in rising floodwaters, to this confident, joyful being who sang to plants and chattered to butterflies. Sophie still carried Otto the otter with her at bedtime, still spoke of her mother with love and remembrance, but the raw edges of her grief had softened, making space for new happiness without diminishing what had come before. The sound of a car in the driveway drew Eliza's attention. Daniel was home early from the bridge site, where construction had finally begun after months of redesign and preparation. She felt the familiar flutter in her heart at the sight of him, a sensation that hadn't diminished with familiarity but had instead deepened, rooted now in intimate knowledge rather than just attraction. "Daddy's home!" Sophie called, abandoning her harvest basket to run toward her father. Daniel caught her in his arms, swinging her in a circle that elicited peals of laughter. Eliza stepped onto the porch, smiling at the scene before her. This was her family now, officially as of last month when Daniel had asked her to marry him during a sunset walk along the repaired harbor promenade. The simple diamond ring on her finger caught the afternoon light as she raised her hand in greeting. "You're early," she called as Daniel approached, Sophie now perched on his shoulders. "Good news deserved an early departure," he replied, his smile suggesting something significant. "The first support pylon passed all stability tests. We're officially ahead of schedule and under budget." "That calls for a celebration," Eliza said as he climbed the steps to join her on the porch. He kissed her lightly, mindful of Sophie giggling above them. "I thought so too," Daniel agreed. "But first, I think we have a very important appointment to keep." Sophie immediately began wiggling with excitement. "Is it time? Are we going to see Hope?" Today marked a milestone they had all been anticipating. Hope, the seal pup, now fully recovered, was being released back into the ocean. Sophie, who had faithfully visited the rehabilitation center twice a week for the past 3 months, helping with feedings and socialization, had been counting down the days. "The release team is meeting at the North Cove in an hour," Daniel confirmed. "We have just enough time to change and get there." The North Cove was a protected inlet just outside town, known for its calm waters and healthy seal population. As they arrived, they found a small crowd already gathered: the rehabilitation team, local officials, a few reporters, and several families with children who had followed Hope's recovery story. The seal pup, now sleek and healthy, waited in a special carrier near the water's edge. Dr. Larson, the lead veterinarian, spotted Sophie and waved her over. "Our most dedicated volunteer has arrived," she announced with a warm smile. "Hope has been waiting for you, Sophie." Sophie approached the carrier reverently, kneeling to peer inside. Hope looked back at her with large, expressive eyes that seemed to hold recognition. "She remembers me," Sophie whispered. "I'm sure she does," Dr. Larson agreed. "You've been a very important part of her recovery. Would you like to help with her release?" Sophie's eyes widened. "Can I really?" "We think it's only fitting," the veterinarian replied. "After all, you were there when she was found. It seems right that you should be there to say goodbye as she returns home." Tears sprang to Eliza's eyes as she watched Dr. Larson explain to Sophie how the release would work. Daniel's arm slipped around her waist, pulling her close against his side. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, noticing her tears. Eliza nodded. "Just thinking about how far we've all come since that day. How close I came to not being in that exact spot at that exact moment when Sophie needed someone." "Some things are meant to be," Daniel murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple, "even if they start with disaster." The release team was ready. Sophie, wearing special gloves and following Dr. Larson's instructions carefully, helped open the carrier door. For a moment, Hope hesitated, peering out at the ocean as if remembering a distant dream. Then, with sudden purpose, she shuffled forward, her body moving more gracefully as she reached the water's edge. A small wave washed over her, and she seemed to come alive, slipping into the sea with a powerful thrust of her flippers. Sophie stood at the shoreline, watching as Hope swam in a wide circle, diving and surfacing again as if testing her renewed strength and freedom. The entire cove fell silent, witnesses to this moment of triumphant return. "Look!" Sophie cried suddenly, pointing further out in the cove. A larger seal had appeared, swimming toward Hope with obvious interest. "Is that her mommy?" "It could be," Dr. Larson said, though her tone suggested it was unlikely after so much time. "Or it might be another seal welcoming her to the pod." Hope and the larger seal circled each other, touching noses in what looked remarkably like greeting. Then, to everyone's amazement, they dove together, surfacing several yards away, clearly together. "She found her family," Sophie declared with absolute certainty, "just like we found ours." The simplicity and truth of the child's statement resonated deeply with Eliza. Yes, they had found each other, brought together by crisis, bound now by choice and love. She felt Daniel's hand tighten around hers, knew he was thinking the same thing. As they watched, Hope and her companion swam further out into the cove, eventually disappearing beyond the rocky point that marked its northern boundary. Gone, but not lost, returned to where she belonged, carrying with her the care and love that had helped her heal. Later that evening, after a celebration dinner at Millhaven's newly reopened seafood restaurant, they returned to the hillside house. Sophie, exhausted from the day's excitement, fell asleep almost immediately. Otto clutched in one arm a small stuffed seal, a parting gift from the rehabilitation center, in the other. Daniel and Eliza stood in the doorway of Sophie's room, watching her sleep. The walls, once a guest room's neutral beige, were now painted a cheerful yellow at Sophie's request, decorated with her own artwork and photographs of butterflies, seals, and the three of them together. "She's happy," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Truly happy. I wasn't sure she ever would be again after Rebecca died." "Children are resilient," Eliza replied softly. "But they need love to heal. You gave her that every day, even when you were broken yourself." Daniel turned to her, framing her face with gentle hands. "And you showed me how to find joy again, how to move forward without forgetting the past. You saved us both, Eliza, not just from the flood, but from the grief that was drowning us." They made their way to the back porch, their usual evening retreat, where they could watch the lights of Millhaven twinkling below. The rebuilt town looked almost the same as before the flood, but subtle differences were visible to those who knew where to look. Houses raised on higher foundations, reinforced seawalls protecting the harbor, the emerging structure of Daniel's redesigned bridge spanning the river that had once overflowed with such destructive force. "I submitted my final report on the environmental impact of the flood today," Eliza said as they settled on the porch swing. "The harbor ecosystem is recovering faster than we expected. Nature has an amazing capacity for renewal." "So do people," Daniel observed, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. 3 months ago, I couldn't imagine feeling this complete again, this hopeful about the future." Eliza leaned into his embrace, her head finding its familiar place against his shoulder. "I was thinking today about courage," she said. "Not just the kind it took to jump into floodwaters after Sophie, but the everyday kind. The courage to open your heart again after loss. The courage to build something new when everything familiar has been washed away." "You're the bravest person I know," Daniel said. "From that first moment when you dove into the current after a child you didn't even know, to every day since when you've chosen to love us, to build a life with us, knowing all the risks that come with loving people who have already experienced profound loss." "It doesn't feel like bravery," Eliza replied. "It feels like the only possible choice. Loving you and Sophie isn't something I decided to do. It's something that happened to me, something I couldn't have prevented even if I'd wanted to." Daniel smiled, turning to kiss her gently. "That's how I felt about Rebecca all those years ago. And now, miraculously, I feel it again with you. Not the same, but equally powerful, equally real." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the moon rose over the ocean, casting a silver path across the water. In the garden below, the sunflowers stood as dark silhouettes against the night sky, their seeds ripening for the next generation. "The wedding planner called today," Eliza said eventually. "She wanted to confirm the date and location." "And did you?" Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. "September 15th on the beach at sunrise," Eliza confirmed. "Small ceremony, just close friends and family." Daniel nodded his approval. "Perfect. Simple and meaningful, like us." "Sophie wants to release butterflies instead of throwing flower petals," Eliza added with a smile. "She says it's more environmentally friendly." "She's definitely your stepdaughter," Daniel laughed. Already worrying about ecological impact, the word stepdaughter still felt new on their tongues, a role Eliza was stepping into with both joy and reverence, mindful of the responsibility it entailed. Sophie had been the one to suggest it, matter-of-factly announcing at dinner one evening that if Eliza was going to marry her daddy, that would make her a stepmother, like in Cinderella, but the good kind. "I was thinking," Daniel said, his tone shifting to something more serious, "about the house." Eliza looked up at him questioningly. They had already decided to make the hillside house their permanent home, having agreed that its spaciousness, beautiful location, and the happiness they had found within its walls made it the perfect place to build their future together. "Eleanor's house," Daniel clarified. "I know we've been calling it that still. Eleanor's house. But it's not just hers anymore. It's ours, yours and mine and Sophie's. I thought maybe it's time we started calling it that. Our house. Our home." Tears pricked at Eliza's eyes, unexpected emotion welling up at his words. He was right, of course. She had been holding on to that last connection to her mother, that small linguistic tether to the past. "Our home," she repeated softly, testing the words. They felt right, true in a way that acknowledged both what had been and what now was. "Yes, I'd like that." Daniel's arms tightened around her, solid and secure. "I love you, Eliza Bennett, soon to be Eliza Walsh." "I love you too," she whispered back, "all three names of you." They stayed on the porch until the stars were fully visible, a canopy of light above their home on the hill. Below, the town that had nearly been destroyed was finding its way back to life. Out in the cove, Hope was learning to be wild again, supported by her newly found family. And here, in this house that had seen both grief and joy, three lives that might never have intersected were now inextricably intertwined. The flood had changed everything, washing away barriers, creating new channels, revealing foundations strong enough to build upon. What had begun in crisis had transformed into something beautiful and enduring. A family, a future, a love born from courage that neither of them had known they possessed until the moment it was needed most. As Eliza and Daniel finally rose to go inside, hand in hand under the summer stars, they both knew with absolute certainty that they had found their way home, not to the places they had been before the waters rose, but to something new and stronger, built together from the wreckage of what had been lost. And it was more than enough. It was everything. If you enjoyed today's video, I'm sure you'll love the next one. Don't waste time. Just click on the screen.